The remains of 298 people, many of them children, lie scattered among fields of sunflowers, along with the debris of one of the most modern aircraft flying today. The place is eastern Ukraine. The date, 17th July 2014. It will become known as the worst downing of a civilian aircraft by a military missile in the history of flight. Because this is all that is left of Malaysian Airlines Flight MH17 and the crew and passengers aboard it.
In the months after the crash, every time there was an identification, and my sister-in-law was nearly intact when she was found, but their son is found in many pieces. And every time the police came to tell us what exactly they found.
We don't know exactly what led to the misidentifying of this aircraft. How come they didn't notice that it was a civilian aircraft? It should be very easy to see that.
Since the first day of shut down plane MH17, Russia began to blame Ukraine and to create all possible versions about that.
6.5 years later, in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic, a Dutch court is convening to try 4 men, all in absentia. Of the 298 victims, the vast majority were from the Netherlands, giving the Dutch courts a lead role in investigating the crash and bringing the suspects to trial. This is the story of how the Dutch investigators reached the conclusions that have led to the indictment of 4 men, 3 of them Russians and 1 Ukrainian. However, it also sheds light on a shocking gap in international legislation safeguarding passengers flying over conflict zones, and a tragic sequence of events that led to the packed civilian flight MH17 being shot down in eastern Ukraine. Schiphol Airport, the Netherlands. Today it is eerily quiet as the coronavirus crisis tails off. On the 17th of July 2014, however, the airport was abuzz with people rushing off on business trips or on holiday. Malaysia Airlines Flight 17 was ready for boarding. Just a few months before, the same airline had suffered the worst disappearance in the history of civil aviation, when flight MH17, on its way from Kuala Lumpur to Beijing, had disappeared into thin air. The passenger list included Dutch Senator Wilhelm Witteveen, prominent AIDS activists, business professionals on their way to a medical conference, a nun, and many entire families travelling together to visit loved ones. The flight departed at midday. Midday. There was nothing extraordinary about this flight. Piet Ploeg is the chairman of the MH17 Victims Association.
My brother was a biologist, and he traveled a lot to Asia, and he wanted to show his wife and son where he went all these years. And of course they made a holiday of it. They were going to dive in Bali, but most important, he wanted to show them where he traveled all these years to.
Today, a monument stands close to Schiphol Airport. A light beam through the hole in the rusty iron wall points toward Ukraine, where the plane plunged to the earth. there is a tree planted for every passenger. Ingrid Meyer was travelling with her 3 young daughters, Sophie, 12, Fleur, 10, and Bente, 7. Malaysian actress Shuba J was headed home with her Dutch husband Paul Geus and their infant daughter Kaela. One day, this field of flowers and trees just beyond the runway will be a forest of memories linked to the worst downing of a civilian airplane in Europe's history. Piet Ploek lost his brother, his sister-in-law and his nephew. They were accompanied by a friend.
Daughters of my brother, one of the daughters brought them to the airport. I was having a drink with a few of my colleagues on a terrace. It was very warm weather. And one of my colleagues told me, he looked at his smartphone and said, there's a plane crashed. So I asked, what kind of plane, where did it come from? Yeah, it came from Amsterdam and it went to Kuala Lumpur. And at that moment I knew, because I knew my brother was in that plane. I saw him the day before and we said goodbye. So I know at what time he left from Schiphol. So it was a very big shock to me. So I rushed to home, called my wife, called the daughters of my brother, who didn't go with them on holiday. And so everything began.
2014 was very difficult for Ukraine after the escape of former President Yanukovych, then annexation of Crimea and Russian aggression to Donbass. So information about the plane that were crashed somewhere in Donetsk Oblast, we found very weird, and of course we were too suspicious that this case is strongly connected to the entering to Ukrainian territory, heavy Russian techniques.
Huge areas of Ukraine, as well as the whole of the Crimean Peninsula, were now under the control of so-called separatists, heavily backed by the Russian army. The deepening conflict in the Ukraine, however, did not lead to the closure of Ukrainian airspace to civilian flights. Dr. Heiko van Schindel is an expert in aviation law and advisor to the Russian Federation, who represents families of 3 Russian-born victims who are suing Ukraine for not closing its airspace during the civil conflict, thereby putting hundreds of flights at risk.
Der Ausgangspunkt waren natürlich zunächst erstmal die Ansprüche der Passagiere.
The starting point was, of course, first of all the claims of the passengers, as passengers from the Montreal Agreement. But we as aviation lawyers also came across the fact that we were of the opinion that the airspace over eastern Ukraine should have been closed by the Ukrainian authorities. This was not done. For this reason, we of course first checked whether it would be possible to file a lawsuit in Ukraine against the Ukrainian state, against the Ukrainian air traffic control. But for various reasons, this was prohibited. And so they decided to sue in the Court of Human Rights. International regulators had established a safe altitude for flying over conflict zones at 8,000 meters, or 30,000 feet. There was no reason for crew or passengers of the Flight MH17 to be concerned. Their sights were on the distant capital of Malaysia, 10 hours away. They would be flying over Poland and Ukraine, Russia, and then Iran, India, and the northern Indian Ocean.
Der Umstand, dass MH17 seine Flughöhe geändert hat.
The circumstances in which MH17 changed its altitude could be due to the fact that air traffic control in Ukraine had given the corresponding instructions due to other aircraft that were in this airspace. Or it could also be due to the fact that the plane was thought to be entering Russian airspace. So there would have been a handover between air safety authorities that would have required the plane to descend in altitude.
Höhe, die Flughöhe, die Altitude geändert werden.
After following the standard air route towards Kuala Lumpur, the pilot asked air traffic control of Dnipropetrovsk in Ukraine to deviate north to avoid a storm. Permission was granted. In this animation, made available by the Dutch Air Safety Board, we see the sequence of events as reconstructed by investigators. The aircraft shifted 20 nautical miles north for about half an hour and then returned to its path. The pilot requested permission to climb to 34,000 feet, but the controller denied it, as a Singapore Airlines aircraft was on the same route at that altitude.
Soweit mir bekannt ist, sind die Airlines.
As far as I know, the airlines, all airlines that fly via eastern Ukraine, one of the main international routes to Southeast Asia is there, knew but had not been informed. They flew there under their own initiative. They found out about the downing because, of course, they looked at crisis areas. But ultimately, no airline made the decision to avoid this airspace.
Aber letztendlich hat keine Airline die Entscheidung getroffen, diesen Luftraum zu meiden.
Pieter van Huys is a member of the team of independent open source analysts who go by the collective name of Bellingcat.
There's not really any decent international standards for when someone is to close down the airspace. And at the time, it's true that Ukraine was in conflict, but until several days before MH17 was shut down, there was no Ukrainian aircraft shot down above a certain altitude. And that's because separatists only had shoulder-fired missiles that could not reach civilian aircraft. So until a few days before MH17 was shut down, there was no danger for civil aviation if they flew over the conflict zone at cruising altitude. This changed in the few days preceding MH17s. Ukraine lost some aircraft at a higher altitude, but they maintain to this day that these were not shot down by the separatists because they did not have such weaponry in order to bring them down. They are convinced that they were brought down by the Russian side.
Although the air traffic controllers denied the aircraft permission to climb to 34,000 feet, what happened next has no justification. 13:20 UTC, about 3 hours into the flight. MH17 disappeared off the radar screens of the air traffic controllers. It didn't take long for the news to spread that a large aircraft with Malaysian markings had crashed in eastern Ukraine. First on the site were militia members of the separatist Republic of Donetsk. Igor Burdiga was the first journalist on the scene.
It was very difficult. The next day, or maybe it was the same day, I went. Maybe it was the next day. I managed to get a car to go to Hrabove. I got a driver who could take me there, and we went. The first thing I saw were body parts being taken out from under a seat, or whatever had fallen from the sky. I was shocked. I got my camera out and looked through the viewfinder, and for the rest of the day I followed what was going on through the viewfinder, not directly. Looking through the viewfinder was a little easier.
We had to be sure it was, in fact, the plane of my brother, so we checked the tickets of my brother, the flight information. And I had to tell my parents that their son and daughter-in-law and grandson died. They were very ill at that time. They were in a hospital, and when I came there, they were just looking at the first news footages of the plane crash. So they were looking at the crash site and the wreckage, and they didn't know that their own son died there with his wife and son. So that was very difficult to tell. Yeah.
Ну, вони були приголомшені. Я пам'ятаю якихось двох пенсіонерів, шахтарів з Hrabovого, які
They were shocked. I remember two old-age pensioners miners from Hrabove who took part in the salvage, scouring the fields for remains of people. They told me they'd seen a light, something exploding in the sky, and then they saw objects falling down. They told me they were walking in the fields and found someone's arm. They took it to the search party. They drank half a litre of vodka each after that.
At that moment, there was utter confusion about what had happened. The shock among family members and aviation authorities was overwhelming, and the difficulty in getting to the crash site was to have consequences for the accident investigation. Within hours, Dutch, Australian and Malaysian investigators were in Ukraine, attempting to get to the crash site, but it was a war zone. The confusion gave the newly reorganized Ukrainian armed forces an opportunity to counterattack right through the crash site area, delaying recovery of bodies and the wreck.
We were, of course, in shock, and mostly just normally in shock, because you can't. It's beyond comprehension that this could happen, and I realized that day from now on I am the only son who's left, and I have to take care of the kids, and I have to take care of my parents. And,
As the investigators combed the scene for bodies and aircraft parts, 4 collection zones emerged. One where the cockpit was, another where the portion of the aircraft forward of the wing attachment fell, another where the rear of the aircraft fell, with the wings and engines ending up in even more remote locations. A joint investigation team was set up, including members from Ukraine, Malaysia and Australia, led by the Dutch.
the crash was on a Thursday, and on Saturday the police came to visit us, and the daughters of my brother, and they asked a lot of very intimate questions about my brother and his wife, and about their body, their physics. Are there special places or scarves or that kind of thing? You know, things you don't want to know as a child from your father and mother.
The immediate requirement was to repatriate the bodies. Removing them from the fields in the 4 wreck areas was a harrowing task. It was followed by DNA testing of the victims to match them with names on the passenger list. Locals found passports and toys belonging to the 3 Van der Meer sisters, Sophie, 12, Fleur, 10, and Bente, 7, who had been travelling with their mother, Ingrid. The victims and their personal objects were strewn across a wide field.
You can't imagine how terrible it is to have to hear what they these were detailed descriptions of what they found, and I have lists of it at home. The daughters of my brother, they don't want to know it, and I did, because maybe there's a moment in their lives they want to know, and then I can tell it, and they don't have to go to the police.
As the parts of the aircraft were collected, they were deposited at the airbase at Kielce and Rhein, where a special hangar was placed at the disposal of the investigators, and where eventually all the parts recovered were rebuilt to help identify what happened. This was important to establish the ballistics of the incident, where any explosion might have occurred, and what might have happened to the airframe of the aircraft.
3-4 days after the crash, the government organized a meeting for all next of kin, and there were thousands of them. The king was there, and the queen, the prime minister was there. A lot of parliamentarians, member of parliaments were there, and this was the beginning of a very long period up till today that our government talks with the next of kin, and they defend their rights and give a lot of support in every possible way.
On the 27th of July 2014, the whole of the Netherlands mourned their dead. The Malaysia Airlines Flight MH17 killed more Dutch citizens in a single event than any other since the end of the Second World War.
На диво тоді дуже багато журналістів.
There was a surprising number of journalists. I think I remember saying that I'd never seen so many journalists. And no one in the Donetsk region had seen so many journalists from different countries. Japanese, Malaysian, Indonesian, Australian, and Europeans from all over Europe. But both those working in Ukraine and those who hadn't been very interested in the Donbass conflict. It's the catastrophe that drew the world's attention towards the Donbass conflict.
As the aircraft and body parts were slowly repatriated, the investigation got underway. But a group of private individuals was already one step ahead. Bellingcat is a group of independent experts and analysts who use open source intelligence information to track arms and military movements.
Back then, we were all volunteers. We were doing this simply because we thought it was important. I was encouraged also because this was such a big disaster in the Netherlands. And I knew how to do this type of research simply because I was already doing it for a longer period before the crash. And I knew that in the Netherlands there were not many people who knew how to do this back then. So we were just motivated by the fact that it was so important at the time.
But there was still a long way to go. It was a slow and uphill process to find evidence that could be upheld in court. The whole of the Dutch nation demanded not only the truth, but that justice be done. The pressure was on to find evidence that would stand up in court. The Dutch investigators were able to use what parts they had brought back from Ukraine to build a picture of what happened. The carcass of the airliner told a clear story, but it would be up to the investigators to draw the conclusions.
You feel the support, and that, yeah, for us that was very important, and we had to wait a long time before the prosecutors filed a complaint against the 4 suspects. But that wasn't. The next of kin were very worthy in waiting, and that, yeah, I think that is so beautiful that they are, you know, they have all reason to be angry, and they are very dignified.
This animation produced by the Dutch Air Safety Board shows what the prosecutors claim happened. The plane was downed by a Russian-made Buk missile. First of all, a wide spread of holes in the fuselage above the cockpit told the investigators that a missile exploded, and a hail of shrapnel-like objects, some round, some butterfly-shaped, penetrated the cockpit, probably killing the pilot and co-pilot instantly. So it was easy to assume that the shrapnel had been shot into the aircraft by an explosion. The very same explosion would have sent shockwaves down the fuselage of the aircraft. Built mainly of rigid and light carbon-based composites, the fuselage would have cracked and broken rather than bend, tearing the cockpit from the cabin. At that point, the airframe itself would have been subject to loads greater than it was designed for. The wings and the tail section would have separated as the aircraft went into a spin. At 33,000 feet or 10,000 meters, the decompression would have killed the passengers almost instantly.
It would have been possible beforehand that Ukrainian military aircraft were flying on that day, and they were allowed to do that, of course, because it was their airspace. But as far as we knew, there was no Ukrainian aircraft within the vicinity of this airplane, of the MH17 plane. And later radar data has also proven this.
Since the first day of shutdown plane MH17, Russia began to blame Ukraine and to create all possible versions about that. Understanding that fakes will be spread widely, we start in the Parliamentary Assembly of Council of Europe and other international institutions a strong campaign, first of all, to spread the truth about the real information, what happened, and blamed Russian Federation that it is strongly connected to the death of hundreds of people who were on board.
Which missile might have destroyed the Malaysia Airlines Boeing 777? Almost certainly, it would not have been an infrared guided missile that tends to hit engines and does not produce the spray of shrapnel found. The semi-active radar-guided missile does also employ a fragmentation device as a warhead, and it is also logical to assume that the Ukrainian Air Force possesses a stock of former Soviet missiles. However, if it were a medium-range 9M317 or 318 missile from a Buk M1, 2 or other variants of the surface-to-air missile system, it too would be equipped with a proximity fuse activated by the semi-active radar. A far more potent weapon.
Shoulder-fired missiles can only reach until about 4 kilometers altitude maximum. And MH17 was flying at almost 10,000 meters, at 10 kilometers.
A group of amateur and professional researchers, going by the collective name of Bellingcat, began sifting through hours and hours of social media films and photographs, some of which had been posted on Russian social media sites by boastful soldiers.
And it was very normal for soldiers to post images of their military service at the time. They mostly used VK and Odnoklassniki, which are kind of like Russian versions of Facebook. In the months preceding this disaster, we had already found lots of Russian soldiers posting photos of themselves in Ukraine, even though they were part of a secret mission. They simply never expected people to actually find them.
The sheer numbers of pictures posted by Russian military and Ukrainian civilians on social networks helped identify the missile launcher. Once the photos and film had been gathered, Bellingcat investigators matched the photos to actual sites using Google Maps and satellite data. They were able to trace the route of the Buk missile system they believed shot down the plane. They made a map and presented it to Dutch officials, who began the task of verifying what Bellingcat volunteers were suggesting, and created this animation of what was happening in Ukraine during the last hours before the MH17 crash. A powerful Buk missile system with 4 missiles on an independent launcher was roaming the roads of Donetsk.
So it started off in Kursk at the 53rd Anti-Aircraft Missile Brigade in the Russian city of Kursk. And from there it was brought all the way, it drove in a big military convoy to the border with Ukraine. From there it started driving through Ukraine. It was first spotted by an eyewitness in the morning of 17 July in the town of Yenikievo. Then it drove to Donetsk, which was the biggest city of the separatists, in control of the separatists. And from there it drove via Zugres and Torres to Snizhne. And south of Snizhne is finally where it stationed itself.
It began with the report of the National Transportation Board, where they told us it was a Russian Buk rocket who was fired from an area what was controlled by the separatists and also more or less controlled by the Russians. And that was for us a very big shock. How can a civilized country do these things? And later on information came that the book system was in fact a Russian system. It came from Russia. It was handed over at the Russian border to the Ukrainians.
In the days preceding the loss of MH17, 2 Ukrainian aircraft had been downed by rebel anti-aircraft missiles. There was a significant difference between the high-altitude Boeing 777 and the military aircraft targeted by the rebels. Who ordered the attack and who facilitated it? Together with the telephone conversation recorded by the Ukrainian Secret Service of the first militiamen on the scene, the picture that emerged was of a Russian-made missile fired from a mobile unit somewhere in the self-proclaimed Republic of Donbass, a claim vehemently denied both by the Republic itself and by Russia.
We were able to see lots of details on this Buk missile system. In the beginning we only had very few material with which we could make this comparison, but later more detailed videos and higher resolution videos and photographs began to appear. And there's several uniquely identifiable markers on this missile system, such as a small piece of paint on the side, and that used to indicate the number, the unit number, and certain damages on the side. And this made it stand out from other missile systems that were of the similar type.
The Buk can also operate independently, with its own radar locking onto the target and launching the missile. It seems that the colonel in command of the unit did not consult with other radar stations and acted on his own initiative.
The final decision was made by the person who operated this missile system. That is someone with, normally under normal circumstances, that's someone with the rank of a colonel. And normally they would also relay this decision to a central command. But as far as we know, there was no such central command. This missile system was operating on its own, also without a secondary radar system present. So it would have been the officer inside the missile system itself that decided to shoot it down. And we don't know what type of information they had received.
Die Bestimmung, ob das Ganze ein Kriegs- oder kriegsähnlicher
It is up to the Ukrainian government to determine whether the whole thing is a war or warlike state and whether it is forbidden to fly over this territory. If someone came here now to say that the Donetsk government could have said that it is a conflict zone that cannot be flown over, the Ukrainian government would surely have intervened, because it still claims full sovereignty over this airspace. This can also be seen in the fact that it continues to offer air traffic control for this airspace.
Über diesen Luftraum beansprucht. Das sieht man auch daran, dass sie nach wie vor die Flugsicherung für diesen Luftraum anbietet.
We don't know exactly what led to the misidentifying of this aircraft. How come they didn't notice that it was a civilian aircraft? It should be very easy to see that. I mean, we were able to see exactly where civilian aircraft were flying with the website Flight Radar 24. So if they were only had access to this website or were in contact with someone, that would already be sufficient. But also this missile system, as far as I know, should also have radar information that shows it was a civilian aircraft.
We want to know what happened, why did it happen, who was responsible, and not only the one who pushed the button, but also who was in the end responsible for it. And you know, the 4 suspects who are standing trial now, they won't do any time. Even if they are found guilty, they won't go to jail. And for me, it's not so important. I think it's the most important that the world knows who was responsible, and not only because we want justice, but also because we want to prevent it. This may never happen again.
Then the investigators came across the closest they would ever get to a smoking gun. Part of a Buk missile found in the fields close to the wreckage of the airliner, and these butterfly-shaped pieces of shrapnel that are typical of the Buk missile. How did investigators track the system that brought down Flight MH17? Social media pictures show the same paint on the side of the missile as it is being moved from its home in Kursk, deep within Russia, to its position in Donbass. The Buk launcher, or Tailor, left the city of Donetsk carried on a white flatbed Volvo truck at 11 a.m. Ukraine time, just as MH17 passengers were checking in. The Buk missile system was unloaded from the flatbed truck and moved independently to the firing point near Schnitzne at around 1 p.m. local time, half an hour before MH17 took off. Investigators turned to intelligence sources for more information. If this was the missile that downed Flight MH17, then a number of people could be indicted as suspects.
At the time, Ukraine did not know which individuals were the ones responsible. They did know that it was shot down from separatist territory with a Buk missile launcher, but they did not know which group operated this system. The chatter afterwards, they were quite amazed because they really believed that they had shot down a Sukhoi aircraft, like had also happened in the day before. But they were so convinced of that they kept telling themselves that they had shot down such an aircraft, but that this Sukhoi aircraft in its turn shot down MH17.
The painstaking work of the joint investigation team now began to bear fruit. Not only had the dynamic of the accident been identified, but also the missile that had been used to shoot down the plane, despite attempts by Russian officials to spread doubt and false information.
Definitely, they wanted to hide any evidence that could tie first the Russian and separatist sides to the downing, because they immediately wanted to blame Ukraine for it, but also this evidence of Russian involvement, because it was a Russian missile system. It's not just evidence of a war crime on the Russian side, but it also shows that the entire uprising in eastern Ukraine was orchestrated by Russia. It was led by them.
Documents proved that all people who were professionals for missile complexes, big or small, no matter the size, they were Russian specialists. So some roles like Temach drivers or someone else, like the lowest level of the involvement, were by the locals, Ukrainian citizens of inhabitants of Donbass, but the crucial and the key role were by Russian military professionals.
By July 2019, the JIT had identified 4 men as being directly involved in mass murder. Igor Girkin was Minister of Defense for the Donetsk People's Republic.
So Igor Girkin was the leader of the separatist movement at the time. His involvement was not he was not directly involved in coordinating this transport that day, as far as we know. But based on the available intercepts, the phone intercepts, he was always pushing to have such a missile system in Ukrainian-held, separatist-held territory of Ukraine in order to shoot down Ukrainian aircraft.
Sergei Dubinsky was head of military intelligence in the Donetsk People's Republic. Oleg Pulatov is accused of accompanying the Buk missile launcher. The fourth man, Leonid Karchenko, was a Ukrainian citizen intercepted in telephone conversations.
Sergei Dubinsky. He was the leader of a military intelligence unit of the separatists. They had created this unit in Ukraine, and like Gherkin, he's also a Russian citizen. And he's the one who actually received this missile system, his troops. He coordinated the entire transport. And then the other two individuals, one of whom is a Ukrainian citizen, Kharchenko, Leonid Kharchenko, and the other Oleg Pulatov, who is a Russian citizen. They are the ones who were actually with the missile launcher, as in standing right next to it and organizing the security of the system at the launch site.
While the trial against the 3 Russian and 1 Ukrainian defendants is a criminal case, the German nationals of Russian origins who have engaged Heiko van Schindel and Professor Elmar Gimuller are suing the Ukraine in a civil court of law.
Wir behandeln unsere Klage vor dem Europäischen Gerichtshof für Menschenrechte.
We are treating our action before the European Court of Human Rights as a single action, sole action. We are also not in coordination with the Dutch government or with other claimants before the Court of Justice, because we have brought an action solely from the point of view of air transport law. While the other lawsuits that are pending, and also the lawsuit brought by the Netherlands itself, the charges that have now been brought are more in the direction of criminal prosecution.
Den Niederlanden selbst, die Anklage, die jetzt erhoben wurde, mehr in Richtung strafrechtlicher Verfolgung geht.
On the 8th of January 2020, Ukraine International Airlines Flight 752 took off from Tehran airport headed to Kiev when it was shot down by 2 anti-aircraft missiles fired by Iranian Revolutionary Guards by mistake. It was just the last in a series of civilian airliners downed by the military in error. In 1987, Iran Air Flight 655, carrying 290 people, was downed by a US Navy anti-aircraft missile fired by the USS Vincennes guided missile cruiser, believing the airliner was in fact an incoming missile. In 1980, the Itavia Flight 870 with 81 people on board was shot down by friendly fire during what is suspected to be a dogfight between Libyan and NATO aircraft over the Italian island of Ustica. Beyond the political interests of conflicting groups, the civilian air lanes of the world are constantly threatened by increasingly inept or undertrained military of states that have lost control of their soldiers on the ground and in the air. Civilian aircraft will continue to be unsuspecting targets in conflicts around the globe until the rules and regulations governing airspace crossings change. Until then, MH17 is a painful reminder of the risks ordinary people take every day whenever they board an international flight that may, unbeknownst to them, be flying over seriously dangerous conflict zones.